just say no.
If there is to be blame, it properly rests here with this president.
Our new Miss America.
Images of the 80s, a special presentation of Time magazine. The story begins here, more than a decade ago, in another time.
The plant will put nearly 3,000 people out of work.
In the year 1979.
Many were caught by surprise when the date was moved up to January. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. Our people are losing that faith.
They seemed like bleak times to Americans, an endless list of things gone wrong. The highest inflation in over 30 years. Lines for gasoline around the block. The worst nuclear accident in history until then. Americans wondered often if they really were in control of their own destiny. They knew who controlled the price of oil. Around the world, communism seemed on the march, from Afghanistan to Nicaragua, while America seemed unable or unwilling to affect events. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran, 56 Americans held hostage, and by extension, the whole nation. Jimmy Carter, however, continued to be associated with failure.
It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. The responsibility is fully my own.
Enter candidate Ronald Wilson Reagan.
I am paid for this microphone.
The next President of the United States, the Honorable Ronald Reagan of California.
Though his answers sometimes sounded awfully simple, Reagan certainly had the questions right.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
Inauguration Day,
that I
1981.
will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Day one of the Reagan era. The nation was still holding its breath to see if the Iranians would hold out on Ronald Reagan as they did on Jimmy Carter.
Some 30 minutes ago,
They did not.
the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of air.
Frankfurt is already a hive of activity at Rheinland Air.
Ronald Reagan had little to do with getting the hostages released, but their return the first day of his first term was the kind of luck that would endure for much of his presidency.
Those who say that we're in a time when there are no heroes, they just don't know where to look. Let us begin an era of national renewal.
Ronald Reagan believed in symbols. To many, the new president himself symbolized a rebirth of the American spirit. Reagan loved being the nation's leading man.
Well, it just seems like yesterday.
He loved the job.
There's the passer.
He loved the role.
To blame this unemployment rate.
And then, barely 2 months into his first term,
John W. Hinckley.
The president has a gunshot wound in the left side of the chest.
the president's courage, not to mention his sense of humor, I hope you're all Republican, he told the doctors, warmed the nation's heart.
How do you feel?
Even before he had fully recovered, Ronald Reagan was back on television.
Now, let's talk about getting spending and inflation under control and cutting your tax rates.
Easy solutions to complex problems. In the 80s, people were encouraged to view the world in simple terms. The good guy versus the bad. When terrorists struck at innocent people, Ronald Reagan ordered the military into action.
Today, we have done what we had to do. If necessary, we shall do it again.
It was the kind of response which at least made a powerful nation feel it was not totally powerless against a form of warfare almost impossible to stop. Throughout much of the Reagan years, the nation embarked on the biggest military buildup in peacetime history.
The Soviets, they have been working, trying to develop this exact kind of system. If they should get it first, it would be a very much more dangerous world.
And then he sent the Marines to keep the peace in Lebanon. Lebanon was never a simple place. And when America sided with the Christians in their civil war with the Muslims, the price was high.
There was like, you'd hear about 1,000 people, it seemed like, screaming, "Help me, God help me."
241 Marines died that day. Their commanders were unprepared for a single man driving a truck full of explosives who was ready to sacrifice himself.
With our mission, there's no way we can have a 100% guarantee.
It wasn't long before the Marines retreated from a place America never understood. After Lebanon, there would be no more complicated military adventures. 2 days after the bombing in Beirut, the president ordered America into a battle it could not lose on the Caribbean island of Grenada.
The Marines came in, stormed into the corridor, yelling, "American soldiers, freeze!"
Was it a valiant rescue of American students, or was it designed to distract us from the failure of Beirut? Not until the end of the decade would American troops face combat again. George Bush's response to the Noriega problem, an American invasion of Panama. The decade did see an end to one war, as finally Americans began to heal the wounds of Vietnam. Finally, the men and women who had served there were welcomed home. And finally, those who died there were truly honored. On the subject of honor,
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
I went into the courtroom innocent of the charges against me, and I come out today still innocent of the charges against me.
And he said, I want you to believe you can raise the $8 million. And said, if you don't do this, I will call you home.
I think it was a very fair sentence if I'd been guilty. I've been totally ethical and proper, as well as lawful in my conduct at all times.
As a matter of fact, I have broken wedding vows. I think I'm probably not alone in that connection.
This will not be like any campaign you've ever seen.
And I've done some dumb things, and I'll do dumb things again.
Fame is a vapor, popularity an accident. Those who cheer today may curse tomorrow. Only one thing endures: character.
Well, regardless of what the commissioner said today, I did not bet on baseball.
The matter of Mr. Rose is now closed. No individual is superior to the game.
And so often America was at its best. 1984 was supposed to be George Orwell's year. So much for prophecy.
It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is proud.
Our flag is red, white, and blue, but our nation is rainbow. Red, yellow, brown, black, and white, we're all precious.
You send a powerful signal to all Americans. There are no doors we cannot unlock.
The 80s will not go down as the decade for total equality. Still, individual Americans did reach higher and higher and higher.
We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle.
And then, as if to remind us of our frailty,
Challenger, go with throttle up. Challenger, go with throttle up. One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles. Obviously a major malfunction.
Wall Street, the longest and most sustained boom in the nation's modern history.
Another big gain, another record high.
Computer-driven trading, corporate mergers, junk bonds, all created a new class of super rich.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed works.
It did not always trickle down as they said it would. Still, there was money to be made everywhere.
Sell 2,000 Royal Dutch at 73 1/4 short.
605 million shares changed hands. Double
The swings grew wilder and wilder.
It's going up and down every couple of days. It's time to get out.
I think we go low before we go high.
October 19th, 1987. Black Monday.
Well, I'd call it the nearest thing to a meltdown I ever want to say.
It's going down and down and down. Never stop.
Rough week. Lost a fortune.
After a while in the 1980s, it was harder and harder to ignore the fact that all was not well.
Prices on America's farms.
Savings and loans are losing an estimated $500
The federal
million.
budget deficit became so enormous that people began to wonder about their grandchildren's ability to pay. In the land of plenty, there is still too little for some. In the land of hope, many dreams go unfulfilled.
Do you solemnly swear
And sometimes it was very difficult to find the truth.
the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do.
We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages.
The Iran-Contra affair.
I don't think it was wrong. I think it was a neat idea.
Oliver North and his compatriots convinced themselves that the only way to preserve the system was to violate the very principles they were meant to uphold.
Sometimes you have to go above the written law.
As I said, I don't know that I did or I don't know that I didn't.
Not to my recollection, but I can't be absolute.
I don't recall going into...
The fact of the matter is that there's nothing I can say that will make the situation right. I was stubborn in my pursuit of a policy that went astray.
But as so often in the Reagan era, success overshadowed failure.
Freedom is the right to question and change the established way of doing things.
It was surely the most unexpected friendship of the decade. The Cold Warrior and the Communist.
Though my pronunciation may give you difficulty, the maxim is, dovii no provii. Trust but verify.
The one man trying to modernize his country before it falls any farther behind. The other, having made his contribution, giving way to his successor.
We do not know what the conclusion will be of this journey, but we're hopeful that the promise of reform will be fulfilled.
Did any one of them have the vaguest idea of how much would change in the concluding months of the 1980s? As in every decade, the 80s would change the way we live. New challenges, new technologies. Who would have thought the compact disc? Stereos on the go. And facsimile imaging transmission. This thing called the fax. What do you do if you're away from home and you left the crossword puzzle behind? You have it faxed. We live in the age of the chip. Computers got faster and smaller. Computer users got smarter and younger. The machines were imported from Japan. But the lifestyle, all homegrown. Television, custom design your own.
Lift it up.
I got it.
Hi, everybody. This is Madison, Wisconsin,
Oh,
where we spent a little
look at
vacation
this.
time. This is the state capital building. Where
Part of the new lifestyle included round-the-clock news and round-the-clock music for the eye as well as the ear. In the 1980s, the whole rhythm of life got faster. Anything less than immediate delivery feels like a waste of time.
All right, tell Steve at 9 is fine for dinner and see if he can get us into Jams. If they don't have a good table, try and get something else. Ken, I need the P&Ls on Atlantic Overseas. I also need the latest ZBBs and PBBs. And Robin, I want you to get me the CEO of IBC ASAP.
The 80s would not have been the 80s without the yuppie. The young urban professionals with disposable dollars and the urge to acquire.
A yuppie is a person who owns a Macintosh, who eats fine quiche and drinks white wine, and that's me.
I aspire towards materialism.
And then by the middle of the decade, the hidden costs of consumerism could no longer be ignored. The wandering garbage barge.
The greatest country on earth, and we can't straighten out a little thing like this. What's going to happen if we ever get in trouble?
6 states and 3 countries without finding a place to unload. It finally ended up in New York, where it began. And there's so much more. Every hour in America, we pump 500,000 tons of toxic chemicals into our environment. We dump 120 tons of toxic waste. And now we know there may be a link between record heat waves in the United States and the raging fires in the Amazon rainforest. The question is, when we look back on the 80s from a distance, will we have paid attention to the warnings? As we stand on the edge of the 1990s, 3 out of 4 Americans describe themselves as environmentalists. A third of all people living in Britain think it's the most consequential issue facing them. In much of the world, West and East, the priorities are changing. At the Horace Porter School in Columbia, Connecticut, grade schoolers are learning a lesson early.
I want the air to be clean, the beaches to be opened with not a lot of garbage on them, and I'd like a lot of animals to be alive.
I think we've learned that if students don't understand their relationship to the natural world, there might be dire consequences.
The stuff that we can't recycle, we throw in the regular trash. Stuff that we can recycle, like trays, there's this thing you put it down, it slides down to the bottom, and then they put it to a factory. If we don't recycle, then we'll have pollution all over the world, and we don't want that.
One day, it's going to be their planet to manage.
Habitat, 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 have to have a habitat, have to have a habitat to carry on. 'Cause when you lose your habitat, you're gone.
The 80s brought confrontation with some age-old problems and new threats we'd never imagined. In the 70s, many saw this as fun, the hip high of pot and coke.
You're gonna know if you're stoned. One even blow, that's all it takes.
In the 1970s, Americans simply didn't know they were going to be overwhelmed by drugs.
Lordy, 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 look what come out your pocket.
In the 1980s, someone figured out how to turn expensive cocaine into cheap, smokable crack.
Crack is the hardest thing for me to walk away from.
First hit was instant addiction.
You want more, and if you don't have the money, you go out stealing, or you'll kill. You do anything for it. I mean, anything.
There has been nothing quite like it to corrupt the American dream so quickly.
Selling drugs is simple, it's easy. It's fast money, it's jewelry, clothes, you know, girls, everything comes with it.
Where there's smoke, there's fire. And where there was crack, there was always more crime.
You sit at 7 o'clock in the evening and people across the street are shooting at random, and you're telling your 4-year-old to hit the floor. Believe me, that is war.
We're getting tough on drugs, and we mean business.
In the 1980s, President Reagan and President Bush each declared a war on drugs.
This is crack cocaine.
Today, there are twice as many addicts as there were 4 years ago.
My son Eddie, sitting in a police car can be wasted by scum, and none of us is safe. And I don't care where you live.
Small towns in America who don't have the problem now need to sit down and take a hard look, because they're going to have it before long.
No one laughs at drugs anymore. Today, 1 child out of every 10 is born with illegal drugs in its system. Maybe the war on drugs will be won in the 90s. Maybe in the next century.
Fighting for our lives, too little is being done too late.
This has been the AIDS decade, the decade of discovery.
By the end of 1981, there were about 100 cases in the world, with most of them being in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles.
We didn't know what it was. I don't know if you remember, but back in 1982, they called it the gay cancer. We thought it was some sort of cancer.
A very slow journey out of ignorance.
Homosexuality will never be accepted.
Gay men were the first to have the disease in large numbers, and the first to suffer the fear and discrimination.
I thought I was a pretty good-looking guy. Average, but happy. Now I actually see myself fading away.
Incidentally, everybody, I'm late, and I'm sorry.
But until Rock Hudson died in 1985, the nation didn't pay much attention.
I think the Hollywood at this point, because of him and because of AIDS, is a much closer-knit family.
When a celebrity dies, people notice. But at the end of the decade, there is concern that maybe the nation is complacent again.
The complacency that threatens us is lulling people into a sense of confidence that we're somehow controlling this problem, which is not under control worldwide.
There are more than twice as many teenagers with AIDS, many of them runaways, as there were 2 years ago. 3 times as many women.
The heterosexual epidemic is like a long, slow wave that builds and builds, and we can see that wave building in the Western countries.
Brian Hoyt, Gary Johnson, Bill Mercier.
At the beginning of the decade, the first diagnosis of AIDS. At the end, more than 1 million people infected with the AIDS virus in America alone. 5 million in the world. Perhaps there will be a cure or a vaccine in the next decade, or maybe in the next century. In the 1980s, when nature struck with such force in Ethiopia, hundreds of thousands of people died. Elsewhere in the world, people responded. And for as long as the commitment was extended, those of us who are so much better off made a difference. And then our attention wandered. It is sometimes difficult to see hope in all this, but there is this much. Science and technology have now reached a point where this loss of life and land can be reduced, if not eliminated. It has become more a matter of political will than anything else. For drugs, more money, education, and law enforcement. For AIDS, more research, and more attention. Subjects for the next decade, or maybe the next century. A student, a housewife, a playwright, an electrician. In the 1980s, they truly rewrote history. It was a good decade for democracy. It first stirred in Poland. Lech Wałęsa led the strike at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk for lower food prices. But Poles were really bidding for more control of their lives. Solidarity, the first independent labor union in the Soviet bloc. But when the union challenged the entire communist system, the Polish military, fearing Soviet intervention, declared martial law. The union was outlawed, its leaders arrested or driven underground. It was too soon for solidarity then, but its time would come. In the Soviet Union, the 1980s began with very familiar images. But the old order gradually died off. Within 2 years, an era no one had foreseen would begin. Mikhail Gorbachev demanded change. His nation was slipping ever closer to third world status. So he called for the economy to be restructured, for incentive to be encouraged, perestroika. He freed dissidents and made it easier for people to emigrate. He called for a new openness.
Fair constitutional change is what we need here.
For debate and criticism.
Once and for all, let's get rid of reserved seats for party organization.
Glasnost. And the stirring became real life. The movement for change in China was already underway when Mikhail Gorbachev came to pay a visit. Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping toasted the first Sino-Soviet summit in 30 years. But in Tiananmen Square, the inspiration was democracy.
Government of the people, by the people, for the people. We just want to have some change in China's political and economic system.
We strike, and strike.
What happened here was seen everywhere. These are some of the brightest images of the 1980s.
Today, we unveil a statue. She is the goddess of democracy.
At first, this enormous energy for change gave many people hope. But then, the response of an aging and insecure Communist Party. These are some of the darkest images of the 1980s. And these may be the images which endure. In the 1980s, television conveyed so many images of people facing overwhelming power. From Palestinians trying to free themselves from Israeli rule, to South African blacks trying to free themselves and win black majority rule.
We don't shoot people who are in opposition to the government.
If you find yourself being shot, that will be completely your own fault.
In so many places, a bloody struggle just to make a few yards. In so many places, democracy was a work in progress. In the Philippines, they called it the People Power Revolution.
The moment they can prove to me that I'm an unwanted, what do they call me, dictator, I'll get out.
I hereby affirm my candidacy.
We have done everything to make the elections fair, honest, and clean.
This has been a violent and shameful election in terms of the fraud and intimidation.
Aquino!
It was a struggle. But eventually, the people of the Philippines drove Ferdinand Marcos out and proclaimed Corazon Aquino president. 3 years and 6 coup attempts later, President Aquino is just holding on.
In spite of all of the coup attempts, you have stuck by me.
Democracy in the Philippines is still a work in progress. But the power of the idea was everywhere in the decade. In Argentina, in Haiti, in Korea, in Pakistan, in Chile. In Eastern Europe, which the Soviets had held by force since World War II, Mikhail Gorbachev said that Moscow would no longer interfere. The people felt free to act. Poland's solidarity was never dead, only in hibernation. Today, the independent union movement leads a government with a non-communist majority. Solidarity's time had come after all. In Hungary, where Soviet tanks had broken the last revolution in the 1950s, the revolution of the 80s was gradual. The Communist Party was forced to apologize for the Soviet crackdown in the 50s. The party was forced by the people to call free elections. And when Hungary began to roll up the Iron Curtain, tens of thousands of East Germans saw it on West German television. The word spread in no time.
Wunderbar, super, ganz super.
First, they headed for those openings in the fence between Hungary and Austria.
Let's go!
And then they headed for the West German embassy in Czechoslovakia. The pressure of East Germans fleeing in such numbers forced the East German government to make one concession after another. The country was hemorrhaging. The pressure was too much. The communist leadership buckled. Travel restrictions, it said, would be lifted. It was a momentous declaration. And that very night, for the first time since 1961, they made a hole in the Berlin Wall. It had not seemed possible only months ago.
Oh, I happy.
Now anything seemed possible. Romania, In the last days of the decade, even the hardline leadership of Nicolae Ceausescu, who had gunned down his own people to stay in power, finally folded. Czechoslovakia, with one of the toughest leaderships in the Soviet sphere. And the Communist Party was brought down in less than a month. At the end of the 1980s, all the walls were coming down. It was a magnificent decade for democracy.
The world has changed, our hopes are new. Your freedom's cry, but it's not through. Make this your year. Make time for time.